Good evening, I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And this evening's Think-In is, to use my colleague Basha Cummings' phrase, at the crossroads of everything. I'm hosting, and you'll see that Basha here is going to try to corral the conversation, hello Basha, about conspiracy theories, about fake news, about a term that was coined right at the very beginning of this by the World Health Organization, right at the beginning of February, not just a pandemic, but an infodemic. And this week, Tortoise's journalism is focused fundamentally on that question of the infodemic. How does it work? Not only who comes up with falsehoods and conspiracy theories, but critically, who distributes them? Who are the super spreaders of the pandemic? And this evening, what we're going to try to do, if you like, is look at how the sausage is made. Try to get to understanding how do you investigate stories that themselves may be untrue, spread and distributed by people who may well be operating on aliases, on platforms themselves that are overwhelmed with a torrent of information and communication. So we can begin to understand how widely, how deeply disinformation is sown in our society, and a little what the consequences are and what the constructive future for the internet might look like. Now that may seem like an ambitious ask for just an hour, but we're really fortunate that what we've tried to do is bring together people that we've worked with. When we set up Tortoise, one of the things we realized very early on was we didn't need to have all of the expertise to cover the world in our newsroom. That was impossible. We needed to be able to find it. And one of the things that my colleagues have done, not just Basha Cummings in the podcast, What the RFK Jr., but actually Alexi Mostras in the reporting, Ella Hollywood, who's been our lead data scientist on this, is they've really worked with other people. And I want to just introduce you to the three people that we've got who I hope will guide us through the infodemic this evening. Manlio De Domenico. Manlio, are you there? Hello there. Manlio is a senior researcher at the Fondazione Bruno Kessler. So there's so many different languages I have to speak in one sentence there. I tripped over them. But if you've been a follower of our journalism, you'll realize that this is not the first time we've looked at the infodemic in this crisis. This is our second week looking at this subject. And Manlio's work has been, if you like, the starting point for many of us, beginning to understand how things are working on social media, and I'm going to ask him shortly to explain a little bit about it. But tomorrow, when you look in the app, as I hope you will, you'll see a piece by Ella Hollywood and also by a man called Ray Serrato. And Ray is based, I think I'm right to say, Ray, that you're in Berlin, aren't you? Yeah. Is that right? And Ray's is one of those sort of open source investigators. A couple of years ago, I wouldn't even know what that is, but an open source investigator is someone who's not going into the basement of a car park in Washington, DC with a brown paper bag. It's someone who's actually looking at all the things that are widely available, freely available online, to try and piece things together as an investigator using quote unquote open sources. And then Professor Lucy Hooberman, hello Lucy, thank you for joining us this evening, is someone who, if you like, comes more from my world, is someone who's grown up in the traditional media, the BBC and Channel 4, but is now a professor of digital media and innovation at Warwick University, and critically has been helping the NHS try and navigate these issues amongst many others in terms of use of the media. So I hope that together we will begin to understand how conspiracy theories work. I suppose critically, the aim of a Think-In is always to try and get new information and fresh perspectives. And we do that by asking you to come at us, not with questions. In fact, we've got a simple rule of Think-In, as you may know, which is to ban questions. We want you to give your opinion, to give your personal experience, where possible, even your expertise. So do weigh in, let us know in the chat, I'll bring you into the conversation, or just stick your digital hand up and I'll bring you in too. But Ray, if I might, I'm going to start with you, not least because your name's on tomorrow morning's story. And so I wondered whether you could tell us a little bit about how you and Ella Hollywood went about the process of trying to identify who are the super spreaders of disinformation.
Sure. So Ella and I were quite interested in, first we were interested in identifying misinformation that had to do with medical misinformation specifically. And the central question we had is, who are the people that are maybe responsible for helping to propagate verified medical misinformation online? So we first had to start with kind of the idea of what is medical misinformation. So we selected kind of different verified instances of misinformation about maybe coronavirus and 5G, ingredients in vaccines, the origins of the coronavirus, Bill Gates and the microchip. So I think some of the narratives that we're all kind of growing and unfortunately familiar with. And once we did that, we interacted with the API from Facebook and Instagram to kind of pool all of the social media posts that had mentioned any of these conspiracy theories.
Ray, sorry, what's an API?
It's essentially the way that not only Facebook, other social media platforms allow a user to interact with a database where you can retrieve information that you would normally see like on your computer screen, right? You might go to Facebook and browse through your timeline and you'd see posts from maybe a page that you're visiting, like maybe, I don't know, I have to think like Stop 5G in Berlin.
Right.
And an API kind of allows you to query Facebook servers based on a search terms that you might input in, and then retrieve results based on those search terms for any post that might mention those specific keywords.
Right.
So once we had curated keywords related to those specific pieces of medical misinformation, we had a kind of database of around 150,000 posts from public Facebook groups and pages that contained any posts. And we had to go through this and filter out, false positives. So maybe people were actually fact checking some of this medical misinfo. And we were able to kind of classify where we saw groups or pages that were, I would say, maybe cross-pollinating. So they were publishing different pieces of medical misinformation, not just on maybe 5G and coronavirus, but also about vaccines, and how frequently they were doing that, and also how many interactions they had racked up. And by doing so, we were essentially able to identify rather influential accounts who are largely responsible for the majority of interactions on some of these narratives. And we were also able to classify them in specific categories. So you might have like the wellness guru, you might have a kind of health nut, you might have a Scientologist, and that's the gist of it.
And Ray, just one thing that when I first read it, when I looked at the piece that you and Ella had done in the first instance, I kicked myself because one of the key observations was that relatively small numbers of people have very, very large reaches in terms of disinformation. And I suppose I thought that was quite a natural thing. And then when I reread it, I thought to myself, hang on, that's very weird. We think of things being viral because, if you like, they touch everyone and everyone touches everyone else. Why is it that you have, if you like, a concentration of power, this idea of super spreaders of disinformation?
I think the main reason, that we found is that these people who wield these kind of followings, they're followed by a lot of people. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So once they kind of latch on to an idea and decide to maybe dabble in, maybe the purported health risk of 5G exposure, they're suddenly amplifying that idea. It's, hundreds of thousands of followers, and those people also have, maybe they're also influential accounts, or if not, they may be simply private people who are then sharing those posts out onto their own specific, Facebook, their walls or their timelines, where we're not able to get at that data. So that's another interesting thing, is that we often saw that, maybe the total interactions that we saw coming from public groups or pages were often much smaller than kind of the hidden interactions which were happening on people's timelines where researchers can't get at data. So actually the scope of what we're showing is still quite big, but it's, again, I hate to use that cliche, but it is really the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to Ray, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. As you were talking, I was interested to see that Andrew Girdwood made this point about the algorithm rewarding people who were pushing, if you like, the shriller, the more eye-catching argument stories online. I'm going to bring Andrew in a moment, but I wanted to ask Manlio, if I might. Manlio, just tell us a little bit about where you started, because for those people who weren't, if you like, in on the first chapter of our look at the infodemic, we started actually in somewhere similar, not with the 5G story, it wasn't there then, but with some of the, if you like, sort of false medicines and strange theories about how coronavirus started, and that we looked at. Well, you looked at Twitter. Tell us a little bit about how that process began.
Yeah, actually, it sounds like an old story, because 5 months ago, more or less, and we started just to listen to Twitter, because it's an open social network where you have access to the public discussion, and everything started with rumors about the fact that the virus has been engineered in some laboratory in Wuhan, and then it somehow escaped from there. So this attracted our attention at the very beginning. And when I say the very beginning, it's around the 21st of January. But just 10 days after that, there was the first communication by the WHO about the infodemic, the risk of infodemic. So what is an infodemic? Is like an epidemic is the spread of some virus, of a pathogen in a population. An infodemic is the spread of misinformation and disinformation, which is not under control within the same population. So it was very interesting for us, because we started to gather the data from the online social network well before the WHO started to talk about infodemic. So from the very beginning, we have been able to monitor the progress of news and rumors propagating on Twitter worldwide, because we started to listen to all the world discussion worldwide. But after that, the rumor started to mutate like a biological organism, and they started to we started to see also differences, or small differences, variations of the same piece of a rumor, and then it was like really amazing for me. I am a researcher, so for me, I look at this in a scientific way. It was amazing to see how it started from a very specific piece of information, and it reached. Now we call it an ecology of fake news and conspiracies. So now there are so many, and there are so many variations, reach of details, that we are not even going behind each of them in a specific way. We are limiting to monitor the situation, and we have developed some indices mathematically in order to understand if in some part of the world there is some risk about of infodemic going on, and we are feeling this with the WHO.
And Manu, can I just ask you? I'm slightly jumping ahead of ourselves here, but your description of the infodemic mutating in the way in which the pandemic itself, or the virus itself, has mutated or changed, or understanding of it has changed. Are you able to track the impacts that misinformation or disinformation is having on particular communities and groups? And by that, I suppose I'm asking because we started out thinking about this virus as being something that would hit everyone equally, and then realized its impacts are very unequal. And I wondered whether information is true too, by gender, by age, by geography, by income, by education. I wonder whether you've actually begun to look at that.
Yeah, we started to look at that, but I can't give you right now any definitive answer, because it's complicated. We don't work with data, so we don't know the identity of the people. If you want, we work with user data. So we don't know their social and economic status, for instance. We don't know their age or stuff like that, right? But we are starting to do the aggregation of some indicators, and we are correlating this with the data that we have for specific geographic areas. So we are trying to infer actually what you're asking, but we are still have no results, no quantitative results about this. But then getting back to what you were saying, that this is so to the eyes of the people, this is hitting equally. But then if you think about it, it's not hitting equally people online, also offline. This is actually true because it's because of the structure of the network. So the point is, I am a network scientist, so that's why I want to point it out. But the fact that we are connected by a network, so there are interactions and social relationships among us, and the fact that those relationships are not equally distributed, but actually they are very heterogeneously distributed, make possible the appearance of people which are super spreaders, or people who are not super spreaders, but they are placed in specific locations inside this network, for instance, bridging to different communities, and this position in this topology make them very, very important for the exchange of information between different communities. And then even if you don't have a lot of links, but you bring together, you act like a bridge. In Granovetter terms, this would be classified as weak ties.
Yes.
But actually those weak ties are really important for moving the information from one place to another. And then we have, thanks to this topology, we have a lot of emerging phenomena, from echo chambers to that facilitation of social manipulation and all the stuff that we have been studying in the last couple of years.
Okay, well, Manlio, we're gonna try to sort of begin to map some of those networks, those bridges in a moment. I'm gonna bring in Lucy Hooberman if I can, and I'm going to go, if I might, to you, Ella Hollywood, and to Andrew Girdwood in a moment. But Lucy, I'm going to do something really unfair to you just to start with, if that's all right. We're on a thing, you can't do anything, we're all at a distance. What are we talking about here, right? And what I mean by that is, there are things that are clearly untrue, and there are things that are unproven, i.e. there are things that are lies, and there are things that are assertions. And how do you think we should approach the question of the problem that we've got? How should we define it?
Okay, so hello everybody. I think that the conspiracies that were the conspiracy theories that were outlined earlier by Ray, I think we'd broadly speak, we know they're not true. I mean, we know they're not true. So the question is, what are they for? And what are they for? So then you have to think about, you know, if you were my student, you'd be doing a literature review, the history of conspiracy theories, the Cold War, geopolitics, how governments stay in power, what they need, what Russia needs to demonize the West, what Trump needs to secure his base. I can talk about our own government if you like, I just don't want to go too far. But you know, you have to define the question you're asking. So I guess
what I'm specifically asking is, if we take the coronavirus conspiracy theories that people talk about, Bill Gates, extremely popular one, 5G, right, extremely popular. In both of those cases, there is a question, which is, what are Bill Gates's plans to develop neural networks, interfaces between the brain and technology? 5G, what are the impacts of these masts, right? Those are legitimate questions.
And vaccinations. No, I agree. So, I mean, there was an academic in Reading, I don't know if he's still there, called Kevin Warwick. And, you know, in the early 2000s, he was putting chips in himself to see what, you know, what could be done. It's not unknown. There are research streams probably. Vaccines, obviously there's been a lot of debate about vaccines over time. I mean, different immune systems respond differently to different vaccines. I think the the question about autism and vaccines has troubled young mothers for a long time. It's been discredited. I know when it was my time to give my daughter the triple, whatever it's called, vaccination.
Well, yeah.
I just thought, maybe I'm going to give them to her separately. I didn't in the end do that, but I really did think, I had measles. We all had measles in the 60s. It wasn't a big deal. I don't really understand, I understand vaccination programs, but then I did question why put them all together. It's efficiency, isn't it? It's cost saving. Is it safe? I don't know. I mean, I did it, but I think those are real fears.
So let's assume.
Yeah.
But let's assume then. But just take what Ray and Manlio said at the beginning. Let's assume that you can identify things where the stories they're not questions, they're assertions, and they're assertions based without evidence, and they promote exactly the response you described, an individual fear, a fear that might actually deter you from doing the right thing or destabilize you to such an extent you do the wrong thing. In those cases, I guess one of my other big questions is a media question, which is who owns this problem, right? And who can fix it? Okay,
I've got quite strong views on this. I mean, if you look at Brexit, for example, are we allowed to talk about non-COVID?
You're allowed to. We're going to give you the free speech excuse here, Lucy. You can talk about whatever you like.
If you talk about, so if you think about Brexit, I've forgotten what I was actually going to say. Then I'm not sure anyone needed the help of the Russian state to swing the vote for the following reasons. I think that for years, the mainstream media didn't report Europe properly. Years and years of slagging off Europe. And so there are some absurd practices and it was complicated. But did anyone tell the story of war and peace? Did anybody talk about the history of the idea of united Europe and where it came from? It may have come from Pascal. It may have come from, I don't know. There are lots of origins of the idea and why it might be useful to combat the bloodiest sort of centuries of war in Europe. So you've already got a public that is absolutely numb to Europe, and a disenfranchised group of people who've for some reason latched onto Nigel Farage, which has been, and the other reasons, a split in the Tory party. And I'm not sure in terms of the voters. You then have to segment the audience. Who is reading The Sun? Who is reading The Times? Who's watching the BBC? And who's looking at those buses going around saying how much money we're going to save and give to the NHS and the like?
Well, it's a good point as to the extent to which actually this is not just a new phenomenon of social media. I think it's a really, really important point. But, Lucy, I'm going to come back to you in a moment if I may, but I keep on saying I'm going to cover some people and then delaying. So let me just do that for a moment.
Yeah.
Let's just pause at where we are. What we've talked about is the fact that Ray's work has identified this concentration of power among certain super spreaders and the extent to which that it does sit in the hands of a few individuals. And Manlio's work in particular, thinking about the ways in which this is changing over time and not decreasing, but growing over time and developing over time, and your point, Lucy, about the fact this pre-exists in our traditional media. But can I pick up Andrew Girdwood? Just Andrew, you said something which is a sort of assumption that I take to be true, but I don't know whether it is in fact, that the algorithm rewards the more polarizing point of view.
The algorithm rewards interactions. So.
Right.
It's slightly more complicated these days as if fighting back against clickbait. But simply put, it's much easier for a scandalous tabloid to express a story in a way that consumers react to than it is for, say, a government scientist. Those posts will largely get ignored by people and therefore buried by the algorithm. Facebook pioneered it, Twitter copied it, and TikTok's taken it to the next level.
Okay, I see that. All right, and the interactions, and when those conspiracy theories or those fake news stories come up, our instinct is to respond to those because we think this is the story that we're not being told.
Well, I think COVID landed on fertile ground. People who know how the algorithms work made a lot of money with headline news about crystal dolphin medicine.
Yes.
People like David Wolf, for example, headline clickbait stuff to sell food recipes. Eat red food that's good for your blood. Nonsense like that. And they can respond to breaking news far more quickly than anybody official can. So I work with some big farmers on social media, and they're an absolute mess. They don't even know if they want to talk to people or not. It would take them weeks to respond to any breaking news, whereas the people with affiliate deals making money off fake news do so in minutes and with expertise.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. I keep mentioning Ella Hollowood, who worked on this, has actually been the engine of this whole thing. Ella, hello there. Can I ask you, having started out thinking we're going to look at the infodemic, what was the thing that most surprised you in the process of researching it?
I think the fact that they're kind of bodies is what I found really surprising. So we saw a lot of evidence of, like, even within our top 10 super spreaders, they would mention and support each other in their posts. So Robert Kennedy Jr. especially, but they'll post kind of like photos and things. Just they see themselves almost as, particularly within medical misinformation, it seems like they're almost part of a movement as the way they see it, and they're all on the right side together. And I didn't expect that at all.
So it's not, in that sense, it's not quote unquote viral. It's more coordinated than that.
Yeah, and it's kind of maybe more of a worldview than I expected. I thought that they'd be kind of like individuals who are maybe a bit cynical about wanting to push a certain message, maybe to make money or something like that. But it was, I don't know, there just also seemed to be evidence of, kind of collaborating, I guess, which I was not expecting at all.
Ella, thank you. Mostly thank you for doing the work, because it's really extraordinarily revealing. I'm going to come to Umar Hassan, who's got his hand up, and then I'd like to bring Aid Clulo too. But I'm going to go to my colleague Basha Cummings in a moment as well, because I want to hear what she thinks, having had the conversation with Bobby Kennedy Jr. amongst others. But Umar, why don't you go first? Because hi there.
Hello, James.
What do you think of this?
I think it's a very complicated issue because you've got the big tech platforms and they're very open. So you've got Twitter and Facebook. So within a big public domain, you've got something like Twitter's got well over 300 million users, Facebook a couple of billion. And the problem with that kind of domain is it's very easy for those platforms to spread misinformation like wildfire. Case in point, I've been following a story for the last couple of months with a YouTube channel called London Real and the well-known conspiracy researcher David Icke.
Mm-hmm.
And it all sort of came about when they did an interview, and I think it was in April, and then David Icke apparently got banned off Facebook, YouTube and other platforms, and then London Real sort of got banned, but I think it was more like a shadow ban. But the issue is why are these actors profiting from misinformation?
Yeah.
And why are bad actors cashing in on what seems to be a very lucrative market? Because the more you can spread those theories around, the more people are going to get worked up about it, and then the more they're going to support it. So it all comes back to a piece I read about called The Internet of Beefs, and it's talking about how beef-only thinkers, a beef-only figure is somebody who just expresses support for anything, no matter how much they don't agree or disagree with it. It's like tribalism, but with social media, for example.
It's really, Umar, it's really interesting this, isn't it? Because as you were speaking, I was just looking at some of the things that people are saying in the chat, and they keep coming back to this same theme, which is, to my mind, is about power, is who owns the information. And this sense, it's interesting that it touches upon what's really happening. For example, London Real is really interesting in that sense. What's happening as regards Bill Gates is really interesting. And I just wanted to bounce from what you were saying, Umar, to what Aid Clulo said in the chat. Aid, I don't know whether you're there and able to weigh in, but you said we've done a lot of talking here about the how it works, but we haven't touched on why it's happening. And I'm regurgitating your question to you unfairly, but what do you think?
I think you're always going to get people who want to, as the chat was discussing, to undermine governments, to question everything that a government is trying to put out there. You will inevitably do that. You get that political discourse, but then it reaches a more extreme level where people are quite happy to peddle untruths and fake news on a whole range of social media platforms. But I think we've learned, we've been learning this evening and hearing the sort of how that happens. But I think it's a really interesting question about why people then propagate that, and why people, probably unwittingly in some cases, but in other cases they must know that that something is not a mainstream view, yet they're still happy to share that. And so I think it comes back to a little exchange that just happened on chat, which is really about, fundamentally, do you trust governments or do you not trust them? And therefore, depending on where you sit, at some point in a sort of liberal democracy, I guess you have to trust a government to assume that they're going to do the right thing. And I think this is where it gets just very, very grey, that there are just a lot of people out there who, for whatever reason, have a very, very skeptical view about what the government's intentions are and what they're trying to achieve. But the last thing I'd say, James, sorry, is, yes, you do have a bunch of civil servants working in, let's take the UK model, a bunch of civil servants working pretty honestly, in a pretty hardworking way. Best man, best woman, best person for the job. They're doing their best. And so are they all in this conspiracy, or is it something else? And so that was my point, really. I mean, it's very broad, I know, but that's what I was saying.
But you see, I think it's the great point, possibly the point, is trying to understand the why will help you get closer, I think, to Ella Hollywood's point about the movement, right? I think that Ray was talking about from the beginning, this network. And as you were talking, Ed, I saw Andrew Girdwood saying, look, the why is about people making money. And when fake news started, I was at the BBC at the time. At that point, it made sense to me, as in it was a commercial enterprise. You put up crazy stories and you could generate a certain amount of advertising income. I think, and this is the reason I wondered if I could come to you, Basha, I think there's something else about either a strange movement from the left to the right, i.e. an anti-modernity movement, people who are saying, you know what, I wish that we could go back to a world. I don't like the way the world is changing, and I'm fearful and suspicious of vaccines, 5G masts, etc. And then there's another movement, if you like, which comes from the right, which is, I've always been suspicious of power, most of all state power, government power. And that's the curious, it seems to me, listening to your podcast on Robert Kennedy Jr., Basha, there's this extraordinary coalition of left and right that buying into these conspiracy theories. And I just wondered how you trace it, how you make sense of what's driving it.
Well, I think in that sense, it is actually quite truly bipartisan, in the sense that, the people I spoke to for the podcast were really experts in this field. So I spoke to this guy called Joe Uzinski, who's been studying conspiracy theories for a really long time. When I put it to him, it feels like we're swimming in this stuff. We can't see, we're completely surrounded by it, particularly in the pandemic. He said, no, you're wrong. Actually, the number of conspiracy theories hasn't increased for the last really 30 years. It sits at about 30% is the number of Americans who believe in some kind of conspiracy theory, which made my jaw drop, but he was very blasé about it. He said, you know, conspiracy thinking is a part of the human condition, and we would be wrong to sort of think that we should try and eradicate it. What's wrong is how it's being harnessed by people, either to sell things, to sell phony devices, like somebody said in the chat, you know, things that are going to protect you from 5G. That's where it gets really bad. But the idea that we kind of are questioning and skeptical is not bad. But so he talked me through these numbers. He said 16% believe that, you know, Bill Gates is behind the coronavirus pandemic, that he's doing it for financial gain. That's neither a left nor right theory. And he also gave the brilliant point that because of the Kennedy name, and RFK Jr. is because of Ella's investigation, how they managed to sort of figure out the spread of how far these super spreaders were sort of managing to pass on information, that Kennedy is kind of used as this example by the right wing to say, look, we've got a Democrat, so therefore, you know. So I thought that was a very good point. But to the point that we were talking about earlier about it being a movement, when I spoke to Kennedy, he was, you know, I sort of went into it expecting that somewhere along the line I would be able to catch him out, and you know, I'd be able to get him to falter on the fact that, you know, it is a bit odd to be posting a sort of meme that's really below him as an intellectual, as somebody who's worked as a lawyer for a really long time. You know, should you really, Mr. Kennedy, be posting pictures of memes of Bill Gates, you know, with a photoshopped book that says he's going to microchip everyone? Like, isn't that a bit below you? And he could not, I mean, he sees what he's doing as a continuation of decades of environmental work. For him, this is the same thing. He is fighting big pharma in the same way that he fought big coal companies and Monsanto and DuPont. And that was really the shock for me, is that, you know, he believes that he's fighting for public good. And when I put it to him that, you know, most people now believe that he's become a danger to public health, he was absolutely gobsmacked, like incensed. He just sort of started shouting at me. And I think that was, like Ella said, a shock, because I thought that this was something that even he might be able to see, okay, he's sort of exploiting the pandemic to get his message across. Actually, he sees the pandemic as a crucial time to fight against vaccination. And that was, yeah.
But I think that does speak absolutely to Ella's point, doesn't it, about motivation? I suppose your question, Aid. I'm just going to bring in. There's so many interesting angles to this, but I wanted to bring in Jess Dowson. I hope I pronounced it right, Jess. Particularly because you say, why is it these things particularly strike around medical issues? Where are you there? Yes, you are.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can. Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I just remember over the years. Whenever something has gained international traction, it's been around something related to medicine. As has already been brought up, the MMR triple combo, which, if memory serves, was based upon now thoroughly debunked research by somebody who I think has actually been pretty much stripped from the scientific profession. And yet he still finds safe harbor, as it were, in other nations where I don't want to cast a broad brush, because I feel that's unfair. The nations where there is a significant hold on a right of center mainstream media, places like the UK, like Australia, like the United States, and that is only one very small aspect from how I'm seeing it. And then from the medical aspect, I was wondering whether it was perhaps because, of course, if it's medical, it's not necessarily life or death, but it involves one's own well-being, one's own survival, and survival being one of the oldest natural traits to actually trigger someone into a form of, oh dear, what do I do situation. And when somebody's put into a fight or flight response, or even just feeling mildly threatened, they become more emotional and potentially more able to be manipulated. But that's just been my experience.
Yes.
And you're seeing it with certain other communities now as well. Some communities are fighting back against misinformation for, drugs which are actually helping them live. And it's a mess, frankly.
Yeah. I think, I mean, the reason, Jess, I wanted to bring you in was I definitely think there is a specific thing to look at, which is around medical misinformation and our susceptibility to it. I think what's interesting is how it's begun to play, and I think Aid's point is right, is how it then begins to play into these much, much bigger questions of trust in government and the politicization of it. I did want to, though, bring in one person who said something that really, just in the chat a little before you, Jess, which was about us not admitting to ourselves why certain people believe some of these conspiracy theories. And Danielle, if you're there, are you there? I dropped you in. Danielle Brandon Rocks. I don't know whether you're there. I can see your mic's on, but if your camera's on, will you weigh in and tell us what you mean, who you think believes these things and why?
Okay, what do I do?
There you are. You're there.
Hello, hi. I'm actually Danielle's husband, so it was me who made a comment. Yeah, I think I've just replied briefly to say that what I really meant was, I think a lot of this is driven by an antipathy towards being told what to do. We've just come back from the West Country, and you just have this sense of it being an entirely different country, driven by an entirely different dynamic around thinking. I'm not explaining this very well, but I think that if we constantly say that this is driven by social media, or whether this is driven by foreign entities, I think we miss a crucial point around populism and around the popularity of populism, and about how the fact that there are vast swathes of the country who think differently, and I think are vulnerable to conspiracy thinking in a way that we might find that I'm judging the majority of people on this chat are sort of urban liberals think, and I think it's just a point that we miss constantly.
So that if you think the root of this is economic exclusion or political exclusion
and cultural exclusion, more cultural and intellectual exclusion, far more than economic exclusion.
Okay.
It's very hard if you don't come from that type of background, if you haven't lived that type of life. I was brought up in the country, and I think if you haven't experienced a whole different set of values, I think it's really hard to understand where that's coming from.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Michael.
Michael, thanks very much indeed, Michael. Thanks. Can I just go back to Lucy Hooberman, because Lucy, the point that Michael's just made, and the point that you made right at the beginning about the fact a lot of this existed in pre-social media is true, but there's. I'm sure you want to pick up on some of the other things that people said. I just also wanted to flag up, Katya Staple in the chat here has made the point that actually some of the things we're seeing are definitely accelerated by social media. The AfD in Germany, the links between the anti-vax movement and the AfD, these are things that are fueled by social media. So what do you think about the responsibility question?
Oh. Well, first, can I say something about what the previous speaker said? I don't really want to point to your competitors. There's a very good piece maybe published today in The Atlantic. It's very long.
They're brilliant. Yeah, we love The Atlantic.
We love The Atlantic. And it's an exceptionally long piece, but it's about why the USA has completely not dealt with the pandemic. And one of the experts they interview is completely, adamant that the countries that have done worst, for whatever reason, to do with conspiracies or not, have got populist leaders. America, the UK, Brazil, and there were a couple of others, can't remember. So then you have to think, why is that? And to couple with that, the one thing that all of these leaders need to show leadership to get their countries, to give messages to the country to keep them safe, is trust. And
Yes.
in the pandemic, this is not the case, because the messaging, the attitudes, the let slip attitudes that aren't even the formal messaging. Okay, if a few old people die, we'll blame the Muslims for the problems up north. You know, we blame the care homes for their own problems. Whatever the things that slip out, they're not just slips.
Yeah.
You're really not just slips. Herd immunity is not a slip.
So
I mean, I to get back to social media. Sorry, I think I would love to hear the other speakers' view on this, but mostly fantastic work being done on the understanding of how social media works to spread conspiracies and other messages. Much, much harder, although there is people in the chat who've got strong views on this, to research. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but to prove by research that it makes people vote differently.
Right.
Or it makes people, I mean, Pizzagate made people turn up and, you know, perform actions. There have been attacks out of QAnon messages, but in big populations, it's very, very hard to get to the qualitative. So then you have other questions. Who is responsible for what? I mean, I think, my view, I mean, there has been more published on conspiracy theories and COVID and the pandemic in the last 3 days than I've seen sort of, you know, for a long time, that we're getting lost in the detail. I really, really think there are terrible things happening that people aren't reporting because everyone's obsessed by this. I'm sorry. I just, I think it's part of the smoke screen of the infodemic that is done on purpose.
To keep attention from other things. Well, let me, we've just got a few minutes left, or 10 minutes or so.
Sorry.
I wanted to just bring in, forgive me, Lucy, I just wanted to bring in a couple of other people. In particular, I wanted to turn, if I might, to Carla Ross, because Carla, if I understand correctly, you work at Wellcome, the Wellcome Institute, and I think Wellcome's trying to wrap its collective head around this problem. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. I work in our public engagement team, and we commissioned some research a couple of years ago to understand what effect social media had on parents' vaccination decisions. Did information affect them? It was a very small qualitative study in the UK, and we tracked what they were exposed to on social media over time, and how it made them think and feel, and just sort of speaking to some of the earlier points, actually, what we found on social media was that you know, birds of a feather flock together, and particularly along kind of lines of values and interest, groups played a really important role. And as I was listening to you talking about, you know, what's the why, and I was thinking actually there's multiple whys because there's multiple players, and actually it's probably really about the dynamics between people who are spreading disinformation and people who are spreading misinformation, but with an aim to make a decision or belong in a group. And I think that makes it more complicated. So that was quite interesting. We wondered whether we should be doing more work in this space, because our role is really about how do you enable the public to play their role in science and health research. And of course, the internet and social media is such a massive platform, and one in which we have the sense actually that the kind of whole of the health sector has not really got to grips with it in the same way it got to grips with understanding how it needed to build a better relationship with print media, for example. But there was an awful lot of noise out there, so we commissioned a study to understand, well, who's doing what in this space, and where might we act? And what we actually found was there was an awful lot of attention on misinformation, and as a result, an awful lot of campaigns to try and counter misinformation. Quite a lot of calls for kind of better laws and legal standards, particularly around politics. But we actually felt that there was a gap in other roles in kind of building the field and corralling the field around social media. And for me, I think there's something important that one of your earlier speakers said it, and there was a lovely phrase I saw in the literature recently called social milling. And this is what people will do with information and what they want to know. They will look for people that they trust to help confirm or disconfirm what they think they should do, or information. And of course, COVID is particularly special because there was a huge vacuum, a big information gap. And what we actually think is that we should be thinking much bigger than misinformation and disinformation, and much more towards actually what does it take to have a much healthier internet or much healthier social media? How do you rethink design in people-centric ways so that disinformation is much less likely to spread, so that high quality information is more likely to spread, so that you make the best of social milling and not the worst of social milling? And I guess our call is for, whether it's organisations like Wellcome or others in the healthcare sector, to start to think about this bigger piece, this bigger field, because the internet and social media is here to stay.
Yeah. Can I, Carla, that is really interesting, and I hadn't heard this phrase, social milling. It makes you think a little bit about how you do interact with that and teach different behaviours, or encourage, incentivize different behaviours. I'm going to go back in a moment if I can to Ray and Manlio, but I just wanted to pick up on a point that Odi Chatterjee made. Obi, are you there? Are you still there? I'm only really seeking. There you are. Hello, Obi. Yeah. The reason I wanted to ask you what you thought is that I think you may have a bee in your bonnet that's similar to the bee in my bonnet, which is around the Intelligence and Security Committee's report into Russia. And I was just interested for you just to explain what you've done. You tried to understand information to get access to it.
Yeah, so I made a freedom of information request. I guess I wasn't the only one back in November, because the election had been announced, and there was because Parliament was closed down, the report had been prepared and redacted by the intelligence services, and so there didn't seem to be anything much that was waiting for it to be published, other than Boris Johnson's approval, for which he would normally be expected to do that within 10 days, which had come and gone. And so I made a freedom of information request to the Cabinet Office to ask whether they could do that. Well, eventually I got a reply from them, which was that under a particular article of the Freedom of Information request, which I think it was 22, which basically says that it's about to be published and therefore there's no point in us publishing it before them, then it wasn't it wasn't up to them to publish it. Then I appealed. Then I got the answer back that, yes, we confirm our decision. Then I appealed to the Information Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner came back and said, eventually, kind of earlier this year, a few months ago, that actually now they've changed their basis for not publishing it to Article 23, which is about it's something to do with the Secret Service, and therefore it's not something that's covered by the information the Freedom of Information Act. Well, first of all, I can't imagine that a lawyer working for 10 Downing Street wouldn't have a clue that that was something that they could use as a basis in the first place, rather than having to rely on something else. But it's just that what was the point of delaying publication? There seems to have been nothing particularly special about it, and except that what was not in it, and which they explained when they published it, was the total disinterest from the government in checking whether or not there had been any interference in the referendum.
Obi, I totally agree. I mean, there is something, this is a whole other thinking, which is not the failure to find the answers, but the failure to ask the questions. I completely agree and understand that point. I'm going to just invite Katya Stapleton to make one point. Katya, if you're there, I just wanted to make a point between, because you raised this point about the difference between clickbait and conspiracy theories.
Yes. Well, I think we've been turning around this point throughout the whole discussion, but I think for one, the underlying human sort of need to like explain phenomena that are maybe too complicated, to gossip, to be mistrustful of government. I think all of this is not new, and I mentioned JFK's assassination, which sparked a huge amount of conspiracy theories. How you can share it is different, but then this will be exploited commercially also is I can see how that will be done for ad revenue, etc. But like the possibility to meddle with the outcome of elections, to actually be an extra tool or weapon in the arsenal of states, what I think you called the sort of technological complex. I think you called it in one of your voicemails. I think that is a completely different thing, like sort of, and which has not really to do with that human need to gossip. It's when it exploits it, but it's different. I think it's a very different field. So I think these two should be separated.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, and it's interesting, obviously, the way in which the platforms themselves actually can promote both and not discern between the two. I'm going to, Katia, thank you. I know that lots of people have got points, and I see Sam Houston's point about trying to pull together all of the articles and research that's been flagged up in this conversation. We'll try and do that, Sam, make sure that gets to everyone too. But can I just go back for a final word, if you like, to the sort of, to Manlio and to Ray, because you've been drivers of this. Manlio, do you have a view of what could be done that could make, I know this is a cliche, but the internet a safer place?
Well, actually, that's the billion-dollar question. I think that we have to change our way of attacking the problem, because as has been said in somehow, the problem of disinformation and misinformation is a problem of our society. We exploited in the last centuries to do whatever thing we wanted to do. But the point is that in the era of internet, information travel much faster because by design. So and it's much cheaper to disseminate information on the internet than you do in the physical world. It's cheaper, it's faster, you can hide your identity better. So there are some issues with the internet that we cannot deal with, essentially, without violating some civil rights, if you want. So in order to keep our rights to express ourselves and so on, we don't have to put more censorship or stuff like that. We have simply to attack the problem from another perspective. And at the very beginning, I remember that Wikipedia had similar issues with the type of information that was going on the website. But actually, after 10, 15 years, Wikipedia is one of the best websites where you can find reliable information most of the time, let's say, or at least accurate. So we have to move from I think the paradigm where we need 100% accurate information to a paradigm where we are happy with 99% accurate information. Yeah. And this will be already an achievement, because that 1% less will require much less efforts worldwide in terms of human work. And you can achieve that also by exploiting the wisdom of the crowd somehow, and using also machines to assist you, not to replace you. This is important. So you can use really machines to help with this job.
Manlio, thank you. I feel like we're just getting going on something which is a whole other subject, and we should look at it, about how we intervene, how we respond. But Ray, I'm going to give you the last word, if I might. I always fear that when you have a conversation like this, you're looking over your shoulder and not looking at what's coming at you. What do you think we should be looking at in terms of what comes next?
That's a really tough question. I mean, I think what we'll continue to see is something that's quite central to actually everything that we're talking about now, which is that increasingly the thing that's being attacked is kind of our understanding and kind of common knowledge about things, whether it's like the potentials of a vaccine or remedies, but really the foundations, our trust in the science that produces those things, which allow us to function in a democracy. or as a society. And I think that's what we should continue to expect. So, you know, in this new reality, the bad guys don't have to steal or tamper with a potential vaccine. They just need to upend our shared understanding about its efficacy or safety of a vaccine, and they can cause real world harm. And I think that's something that that's actually what we need to focus on. I think I agree with Manolo on that point, for sure.
Okay. Well, Ray, thank you. I mean, thank you in particular for the work. I mean, and Manlio too. It's kind of slightly uncool to be thanking people who've worked with us to do great work, but given you're not part, work at Tortoise, but you've worked with us, I really wanted to say how much I appreciated it, because this is complicated. And I just wanted to finish up by observing two things that people have said. One was just to pick up on your phrase, your last phrase there, Ray, common knowledge. You know, it's one of those things that people say to each other. It's common knowledge that XXX, right? And the real risk, of course, is that we don't have common knowledge, right? That actually, the commonness of that knowledge, that shared understanding of things gets broken down. And as a result, a joint response to something which touches all of us is beyond reach. And so, as you say, I think the real world aspect of this is really important. But I just go back to the point that Ella made. You know, when we host think-ins, we try to come away with it with a clearer point of view. And sometimes that comes just in one thing one person says. And in Ella Hollowood's comment about this being a movement, I've just heard that echo through the whole hour. And the reason, of course, is that movements are organizations of people around sets of ideas. And it makes me think that we can look at this in the way in which Abe Clulo touched upon, both in terms of the how and the why, both the how of what, you know, Ray said right at the beginning about how trackable this is, you know, through the existing social media platforms. Manlio, your point too, about understanding the ecology of the infodemic, how it changes, and so the particular forms that it takes. But I do think this point about networks and bridges matters. I do think that understanding, I saw Alan Morgenthau made this point in the chat about, you know, the retweet, the responsibility of the retweet. I was really interested, we didn't get to it, but the responsibility of celebrity influencers. So there's a how to this. And then I'm really struck by the why, the what's motivating people, the point that Michael made about, you know, exclusion, social, cultural, political. And ultimately, I think the thing that you'll come to if you listen to Basha's podcast, if you read the reporting over the next few days, is this note that I suppose Carla Ross struck right at the end there, which is how do we find an understanding and response to the intolerant aspects of populism, she's quoting Michael Sandel, but also its legitimate concerns and the distinction between those two things. And I suppose the point that Lucy Hooberman made right at the start, which is these things have been the preoccupation of media long before social media, means that you're speaking about something which is a why in our society as well as a how in our social media. And I hope that that gives us a way of thinking about how we tackle and think about conspiracy theories. I suspect you can see this is a subject of deep interest to us, and it won't stop here. Please do look at the reporting, particularly the data journalism that we're doing over the coming days on the infodemic, and we promise to keep looking at this subject. But for now, please join me. You can't give a round of applause to Manlio, to Ray, and to Lucy, but please, and for that matter to Basha, but please do give them a hearty and cheerful wave, and have a good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.